So, Rex, just tell me, you know, who you are, where you, and a little bit about you, very short.
Sure. Name is Rex Sheppard. I was in the Royal Fusiliers, although possibly by accident, because I started in the Royal Norfolks at Norwich, done 6 weeks square bashing as it was affectionately known, went to Bury's Nedmans for further training, and then directly out to Hong Kong, where I was attached to the Middlesex Regiment, as were quite a few of our intake. And then to make up the strength of the Royal Fusiliers who had arrived in Korea in July 52, we were transferred to the Royal Fusiliers. So it was a roundabout way of getting into the City of London Regiment.
Okay, good. What was the story behind you joining?
Okay, well, when you're in those days, in the 1950s, bearing in mind the war had not long finished, we were Jack the lads and enjoying life as a 16, 17, 18-year-old. But then national service was brought into being, and you had no choice other than obviously to obey the command of going in national service. So I joined up and reported to the Norwich barracks, which was quite a shock to the system after coming out of youth and civilian life into a pretty harsh, disciplined army routine. But again, you very, very quickly adapted to it, you very quickly got used to it, you formed a lot of friendships which have stuck right through to even the present day in many cases. Do you want me to carry on?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So yes, it was Norwich, and the Norwich Britannia barracks where we were stationed was, for some odd reason, right next to Norwich Prison. So the prisoners used to wave to us when we were square bashing, and if we tried to sort of wave back, we got a blast from the Sergeant Major, who was quite a horrific, frightening figure anyway. And from Norwich, we had a passing out parade after 6 weeks, where you were taught drill, weapon training, the way you actually handled your rifle and all the various drills. Then on to Bury's Nedmans for a further spell of training, which was a little bit more rigorous, I guess. That involved bayoneting sandbags, simulating bayoneting a body, obviously. And 10 weeks there, and it was pretty hard because there were night exercises, obviously to get us used to what was coming. And from there, we then had a short leave, and on January the 17th, we embarked on the Empire Windrush, which, funnily enough, was one of the boats that brought the first Jamaican people across here. And this was berthed at Southampton, probably the biggest boat that we'd ever seen in our life, probably the furthest I'd ever been in my life, Southampton, at that age, because in those days you were very parochial and stayed in your own district.
When did you sort of realise that the training was not about a conscription, and it was actually a training for a purpose? And what was your, what was the mindset there?
Yeah, okay. As always with a congregation of people, there were rumours floating around. The Malayan War was on, the Korean War had started, and I suppose putting 2 and 2 together, we had a bit of a gut feeling we could finish up in one of those 2 places. So after having sort of absorbed those facts, we knew the training we were getting was for something with some specific purpose in mind. Particularly when you got live firing on the range, seeing how good you were at actually hitting targets, going out on to exercises in woods with wooden pop-up men popping up, which you quickly had to react to and fire off a round or 2 at them. And then, as I say, the bayonet practice was charging at a sack full of straw, which was suspended by a sort of wooden frame. And we were told that the more noise you make when you're charging with your rifle and your bayonet on the end like that, the more frightening it comes to the recipient. So to us it seemed an odd sort of thing that we'd go charging toward this, yelling at the top of a voice, sticking a bayonet in a lump of straw and pulling it out again and carrying on, and we would say, oh, well done, you know. But again, that was obviously for a purpose, because there was a certain amount of hand-to-hand fighting later on in life. So yes, we realised that we were being trained, A, to be a soldier, and as our sergeant told us, when you've finished your training, you'll literally be a killing machine, which was, you know, quite a frightening sort of thing when you've only been out of school about 3 years. I left school at 15, in the army at 18, and that's a very narrow gap between 15 and 18 to suddenly be told those sort of things, you know. So that's how that actually went. The training was pretty tough, pretty rigorous, and quite strenuous, I suppose, really, in that period. But as I say, when we got to, if I can go on to Southampton now.
Yeah. Yeah. So you were talking about what was it like when you suddenly were told, actually, right, you're not going to be in Suffolk anymore, you are moving? Mm. What was your feeling? How did friends and family react to that?
I suppose apprehension, because to be perfectly honest, none of us had ever heard of Korea. We'd only vaguely heard of Malaya through maybe geography lessons, but certainly not Korea. Didn't even know where it was. I can remember coming home on a few days' leave prior to going, telling my parents, who were absolutely horrified, my God, boy, you look after yourself and all this, you know, as parents would. But again, I think when you've moulded yourself with a group of friends, which you've made friends with, you don't think too much just for an individual, for yourself. I think the whole thing sort of bonds together, and you all realise you're all going to the same destination and you're all in this together. That was the way it seemed at the time anyway. So, as I say, we took off by train to Southampton, furthest I'd ever been out of Ipswich in my whole life, and saw this enormous boat, which I think was something like 22,000 tons or something like that, biggest boat I've ever seen. And we embarked on this, and it was an old German captured boat from the previous World War II. Quite a wreck in some ways, because it took 5 weeks and 4 days to reach Hong Kong. Several different breakdowns on the way. The worst recollection of that journey was going through the Bay of Biscay, because it was middle of January, or towards the end of January, and the seas were quite mountainous, and I think everyone but everyone was seasick. And I know on one occasion I was laying, I don't know, on the deck, probably as a technical name for it, in the scuppers or whatever. And I think, honestly, if somebody had just put the foot underneath me and rolled overboard, I'd have said thank you very much, because I was convinced I was dying, you know. You're literally sick so much that in the end you're just bringing up a green fluid, and your stomach is so strained, it's horrible. But again, you do get your sea legs, and subsequently the journey carried on through sort of rough and calm waters. Stopped at one or two various ports on the way out. We saw Gibraltar in the distance. We didn't stop there. We stopped at Aden. We stopped at Colombo, which I think is now called Sri Lanka. We stopped at Singapore, all for sort of taking on provisions and having a half a day's shore leave. And eventually reached Hong Kong, which you know, seemed such an exotic place in those days. We're here in Hong Kong. And I think the first sight when we disembarked and formed up into some sort of rabble prior to getting on to 3-ton army lorries was to see a lot of very attractive young Chinese ladies with slit skirts up to there, Bearing in mind we'd been on the water for something like 5.5 weeks, we were soon whisked away from them, unfortunately. And we then boarded these trucks and went up to an area called the New Territories, which is not Hong Kong, it's the other side of the water, and it actually abuts onto the China itself. And one of the ironies of it there, when we were doing training on top of the hills, you could look into the distance and see the Chinese doing exactly the same on the other side. So there we were, one side of the hill sort of preparing to go to Korea, which we then knew was where we were going. The Chinese on the other side preparing to do exactly the same as us, and with probably only a few, well, I don't know, maybe half a mile or so separating us, because there was a demarcation line. There's the border of China and the border of how far Hong Kong and the New Territories extended.